Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. I'm super happy to welcome Peter Bell from the Sons of Patriarchy podcast. So welcome, Peter, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Thanks for having me on. This will be fun. I know a little bit about this podcast, being sent it a few years ago, and happy to see that you're kicking it back up again.
Exactly. Yeah, we were just saying before we hit record, we had a bunch of stuff that I did on Doug Wilson probably 3 or 4 years ago now. And there's another name that we mentioned, Sarah Bader. So is she part of the Sons of Patriarchy? What's her role in that as well?
Yeah, she's both co-host and co-producer, and she's also lived in Moscow since 1997, I think, or 1998, one of those two. So she's on the ground in Moscow, knows all the people, knows all the institutions, knows all the things, all the dirt, all the stuff that doesn't get covered in big media that happens in Moscow. But so she's co-host and co-producer, and we are, as it were, sort of like attached to the hip as producers. Mm-hmm. So yeah, she always needs to be talked about or discussed when it comes to Doug and Moscow, because this is her home ground.
Now, there was a reason why she didn't want to be. Did she not want to be a part of this recording today? I'm trying to remember, because we've been emailing back and forth for about maybe a month or so now. Was she not available to be on this? Because I think it would have been really good to have her on.
Yeah, she's in the Pacific time zone, so she's 11 a.m. So this is like right smack in the middle of her
right
of her work day, and I work remotes. So it's a lot easier for me to maneuver my schedule around this. It's either both of us, or it's just her, or it's just me. It just depends on who we're talking to and what time it is, and all that fun stuff.
Exactly. And here I am, 6 hours ahead of you over here, and 8 hours ahead of the West Coast. I'm originally from Seattle, so yeah, I'm familiar with the time zone differences. It's always a challenge, especially here.
I'm in Georgia.
Yeah, we change our clocks at a different. We do ours about 3 weeks later than you do in the States, but then in the autumn, the fall, we do it 3 weeks before. Huh. So the time zones, there's a period there where you're trying to schedule podcasts, and the normal 8-hour, 5-hour time zone doesn't work anymore. You know, so
absolutely, yeah,
it's a mess. But
I have
for
to
American football
fans
like me, see, I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan. That's where I was born and raised. So
this is a happy year
we get to watch the games an hour earlier for about 3 weeks, so I don't have to stay up. It starts at normally 6 p.m. at night on a Sunday, so it's hardcore. You got to be committed to stay up late to watch the NFL, but it's the way it is. But now there's another connection we have through the Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho Facebook page. Yep. What exactly is their role in the Sons of Patriarchy? Because obviously follow them on Facebook. We talk a lot. Anytime there's something on Wilson or something that comes up, a corollary to that. What's your connection with that Facebook page?
Yeah, well, I got connected with them. I mean, I've known about them since I joined the Twitter space, and I've always been on Facebook, but not in this capacity before. But I had known about them since 2019, 2020, maybe particularly so, because I went to Westminster Seminary, California, in Escondido, California. And one of our professors, R. Scott Clark, is known as like the anti-Doug Wilson, anti-Federal Vision guy. And we always had fun with him because he's always checking for bombs under his car after classes. Like, I know those Wilson guys are after me. Which, now that like we're in 2026, is like, that's probably not far off the truth. I thought he was a conspiracy theorist, but I was like, that might actually be legitimate now.
Exactly. Not paranoia.
No, it's
not
so
paranoid if they really are out to get you. That's what they say, isn't it?
Yep. But so the Facebook page, I'd known about them because they've been posting me about Clark, and Clark really liked them. So I followed them, and the people who compose that tend to be on the confessionally reformed side, and there's some nuance and divergence and some religious and non-religious people behind it too. It's a bigger think tank, but so I got connected with them, and it was like a year or two later sometime, like 2022, 2023, they messaged me saying, hey, you've run a podcast before, you went to Westminster, you're against Doug, you're against kind of this budding Christian nationalist stuff. Would you be interested in developing something with us? And so I said, sure. So they're like, if you want to think of them as the receipt holders, and then I'm sort of the mouthpiece of those receipts. That's like kind of the relationship that we hold.
Right. So there's a definite connection there. So did they
big time,
suggest coming up with the Sons of Patriarchy? Were they saying, yeah, they approached you basically? Because I always wondered how it all started. Because I remember when you first came out, it was maybe, what was it, 2-3 years ago?
Yeah, it was
it
October
was.
2024. So like almost 2 years ago. Yep.
Yeah, because at the time I was really active on X, now Twitter, now X.
Yep.
And I think we connected pretty quickly on Twitter because I was posting my content about Doug Wilson. I did a whole bunch. I think I did about 6 episodes, really long form, 2.5 hour
Yep.
episodes on Wilson. And I said, all right, Sons of Patriarchy, yeah, we have to get together. But now it's taken over 2 years that we finally got
Yep.
this going. I'm glad we finally met, though, because they helped me a lot. I talked to somebody who will remain nameless. I guess it's a group of pastors or ministers. Isn't that what the Examining Doug Wilson Facebook page is? It's a group of concerned evangelicals, as you say, that are very anti-Doug Wilson, anti-Christian nationalism. Is that basically what's going on there?
Yeah, anti-Christian nationalism, anti-Doug Wilson, and then also very concerned with reports and allegations of church abuse and sex abuse and all that stuff within these churches and churches that are related to them. And so their thing is the theology, but then also kind of how does this hit people on the ground?
Well, what was the aim? What is the aim of the Sons of Patriarchy podcast? Because I know you've done a lot of stuff, obviously, on Wilson, but you've done stuff on the Theo Bros. Because it's not just Wilson, is it? This is my concern, is that he's got this cadre of these bearded pastors that love his stuff. They love him setting stuff on fire, smoking cigars and drinking a brandy out in the field, setting a couch on fire with a tin of gasoline. I mean, the quarter November and all this stuff, But he's got these guys like Joe Webb on and other people now that are jumping on that bandwagon. Of course, we'll talk about Pete Hegseth as well. But he's had a huge influence, hasn't he? Is that kind of what you guys cover on your show?
Yeah, you could say our focus, the thing we gravitate around and pursue, is letting people know who Doug Wilson is, where he came from, what his theological and cultural and political commitments are, and then who he's been influenced by, who he's influencing, the networks that he's part of, that he's founded, that he's connected to. So it's like looking at a spider web and trying to find the pinpoint, and then showing people how that spreads, whether that be explicitly or implicitly too. And then with a special focus, like I said before on Examine Doug Wilson Moscow, a special focus on abuse. That we know Christian nationalism, it's a really, really, really hot topic, but it tends to be divorced from how it really hits people now. I mean, people are rightly worried about what's it going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years. But we're also trying to tell people, like, hey, there's some real stories out there that have been affected by this in really horrific ways, and we want to tell you about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke with one woman who was the survivor, Emily. She was a survivor of Doug Wilson's Logos School. I'm sure you know her story, very familiar with it.
Yep.
That's just one example of many. You hear about marital rape and things like that. Some horrific stuff comes out of that biblical patriarchy, Christian patriarchy movement, of which Wilson's is a firm, he's an advocate, obviously. Well, maybe we should start there, because obviously there's a straight through line. I want to get to Pete Hegseth and some of the stuff he's done recently. He's prayed some pretty disturbing prayers. He's had Doug Wilson preach at the Pentagon. He said some pretty disturbing things, casting the war in Iran as this Armageddon type event. Are you happy to start with Doug Wilson? Maybe you could give us a sort of a thumbnail sketch, an overview. Who is Doug Wilson? Where does he come from? And how did he get to be this major influencer? How does a guy like that end up preaching at the Pentagon? Just a few weeks ago, as we're doing this recording now.
Yeah, so we always like saying kind of the billboard version, the elevator pitch is Doug has been a fringe pastor for a long time. Until he wasn't a fringe pastor, he was a mainstream guy. And he grew in influence because he was fringe. It's easy to not take somebody seriously when you think their influence is not very big, and it allows them to grow pretty fast. And so people will be frustrated with us. Why are you giving this guy a platform? Why are you talking about him so much? Why are you giving him so much airtime? I was like, well, it's exactly how he grew, is when you didn't give him airtime, you didn't give him attention, you didn't tell people what he was doing and let him speak for himself, and then breaking down what he's saying. But for Doug, a quick sketch, you have to go to his dad, Jim Wilson, who was a who was in the Navy because he was in
I think he
Maryland.
retired from the Navy, didn't he?
Yep, retired from the Navy, moved to Moscow, Idaho. Doug moved later to Moscow, Idaho, founded a Christian bookstore in the city of Pullman first.
Just right across the border in Washington State. You got two universities there.
Yep.
Yeah,
you got Washington State University
or Washington State University and University of Idaho, don't you? They're literally like minutes apart, basically, aren't they? I grew up in Seattle, so we used to go over to Idaho.
Yep.
And they're right across the border. They're very, very close to Idaho border, aren't they? Washington, Idaho borders right there.
Yeah, they're super close. So he went there, and then, I mean, Jim's kind of explicit thing was he wanted to go to a small enough town to where he can kind of take over, but not a small enough town to where there wasn't major research happening there. So he chose it pretty pointedly because of two major research universities, like you said, one being Washington State, the other one being University of Idaho, but then two smaller cities that you wouldn't think of. I mean, nobody thinks of Pullman outside of college football, and very rarely people think of Moscow, Idaho, if you know Moscow, Idaho, not Moscow, Russia.
Yeah.
But so it was chosen intentionally, and Jim was known for his evangelical warfare. He wrote a book on evangelism and warfare. These are pretty prevalent ideas, and these were instilled into Doug from a very, very young age. And he called himself like a hippy dippy, Jesus loving preacher. But eventually he took over his father's church, legitimately and literally took over his father's church. His father stepped down, and he one day said, like, "Hey guys, I'm the pastor of this church." You can actually hear this from Doug's. Like, he will say this. He'll say, one day there's nobody there, and he's like, "I could preach," and so he literally went up to the pulpit and then started preaching, and then told the elders, like, "Hey, I'm your pastor now." So that was in the 70s, and that, like, it gives you like a tiny little bread piece, a crumb of who he is today, because he has people have talked about him being self-ordained. He has zero ordination, self or outside administered. There's zero ordination whatsoever. He founded the CREC in 1998. He changed his father's church's name from Community Evangelical Fellowship to Christ Church Moscow, or it's Christ Church, but it's now known as Christ Church Moscow. Late 80s-ish, after he turned from believer's baptism into infant baptism, founded a Christian school network in the early 90s, the ACCS, Association of Classical Christian Schools, founded a college, New St. Andrews, Logos School in 1981, because, I mean, legitimately he says this. And all this stuff I say, people can look up these words from his own mouth and see what he says. Because the Christian schools weren't conservative enough, nor were they hard enough in the area. And so he needed to give his kids, Rachel, ND, which is Nathan David, and Rebecca, he needed to give them a hard enough and Christian enough education. And so, all this started in Moscow, and the people in Moscow, and I've met the people in Moscow, and you, having been from Seattle, not too far away from Moscow, it's a few hours trip, probably, I'm going to guess 4 or 5 hours from Moscow. So I know it's like 3-ish hours. Easy. Yeah, it's not a terrific distance. But yeah, he's been known for this, and he's been associated with Christian Reconstructionist thoughts. Which is, you can kind of hear it in the name. It's the current governmental order has to be deconstructed so something else can be reconstructed. He also says he himself would identify with theonomic principles, which is theo is God and nomos is law, with God's law, and that not just influencing society, but being pressed and pushed on to society. And now, like you said, you're seeing that today with Hegseth, you're seeing that today with a lot of other stuff. But I mean, Doug grew because people thought he was this tiny little pastor in Moscow, Idaho, and trying to do his own little thing. And I think he knew that, and was like, I can kind of work in the shadows, and people are not going to take me very seriously until they do start taking him seriously, which began with Hegseth. Actually, it began in COVID, because they had a church psalm sing protest, which everybody has now, for some reason, forgotten.
I know Trump, they did a church-wide protest down in the city center of Moscow, didn't they? Yeah, this is late September 2020.
Yep. And they got arrested, and there's a lot of muddledness around this on how Moscow PD responded to this. But the presenting reason they got arrested was not because they were singing psalms, and they love to play the martyr and say, we sang psalms and the government doesn't want us to worship freely. It's like, you can worship freely in your own church at any time that you possibly want to, but you can't directly defy government mandates because you're going to get arrested or get some sort of ticket. But they were arrested because they didn't present their ID to Moscow PD. Eventually, they won a lawsuit against Moscow PD. That gets really muddled on who was right, who was wrong, where the law was and stuff, how it was handled by local and Moscow media. But it really put them on the center stage because President Donald Trump, then President Donald Trump, his first term, and now his second term, President Donald Trump, he quote tweeted with, "Hey, these are what the libs are doing to you and your free expression of worship," because it was filmed. This whole protest was filmed. So Christchurch loves protesting and filming protests and using that for their advantage. So they exploded onto the scene. And then 2024, with the appointment of Pete Hegseth, and people found out because the CREC could not help themselves to tell everybody that Pete Hegseth had been a member of Pilgrim Hill Reformed Fellowship, which is in Ridgetop, Tennessee, under Brooks Pottinger, who earlier this year was announced as the appointed pastor of Christchurch, D.C., which is where Pete Hegseth is at since he's Secretary of Defense. And then Doug was also
of War. You got to get that right.
I will never ever say Secretary of War. Everybody, I see that all. It's like he's a fool and a LARPer, and I don't want to give him the benefit of being a Secretary of War. So he's a Secretary of Defense. I will stand firm on that ground.
You'll
anybody else who
you're not going to budge. That's a hill you're going to die on for sure.
That's a hill I'm going to die on. But that's in DC, and then things I think really got to a head. At least Doug himself became, I think you can argue, world famous last August in 2025 when CNN did their special Situation Room with Pamela Brown and Wolf Blitzer, where they interviewed Jared Longshore and then Toby Sumpter, which is it's just a trio of dummies that they wanted to interview. Plus Lennox Califungua, who's a I hate using this. He's kind of like their token black guy, as well as Chocolate Knox. And then they also talked to a family at Christchurch, and Pamela Brown went to a service, and then social media just blew up for a good month. Rightly so, because of some of the things that Doug said. One of them, that I think the most famous and quotable, is women are the kind of people that other people come out of. And that just, that lit the evangelical, ex-evangelical, political world on fire. And then Pete, in his infinite wisdom, quote tweets that 6-minute little intro video that was posted by Canon Press saying all of Christ for all of life, and that added even more fuel to the fire. So you get the sense that Doug and his cadre of stupid marketers who love using Jesus for their own purposes are just great, like I said, marketers. They market really Jesus in a way. They market their brand. They use war rhetoric. They use quasi-evangelistic rhetoric, but again, combine that with war stuff. Doug's known for his No Quarter November from 2018. His last rendition was the Ocho in November 2025, where he likes fire and lighting things up and blowing things up, burning Disney princesses, which he did in 2023. I think there's another one. It was the one that he did on the field that he actually gave one of the crew members for Canon Press 3rd-degree burns. And so there's a police report. And I think it was Elijah Froh, one of the followers of Doug, who received burns and had to go to the hospital because of Doug's fiery antics. So that kind of gives you a picture of who this is, what they do, where they're at, and kind of now with Hegseth, the network that they're part of and the tentacles and where those reach.
Yeah, that's it. What I wanted to mention about Doug Wilson, we got to touch, you said earlier, he has no theological accreditation. He does not have a Bible college degree, seminary degree. Now, I covered this because I actually went back and talked to his former professor at the University of Idaho, Dr. Nick Geyer. I interviewed him, and he taught Doug Wilson. He was a philosophy student. He did a master's
Correct.
degree in philosophy, and he promoted his Christian views as a student even. We had a really interesting discussion about that. But I went to Bible college. I went to seminary. I did a PhD in theology and religious study. Biblical studies was my background. Old Testament studies, homiletics. That was my background. I was a pastor. I was a Bible college teacher for 20 years. I put in the time. Sounds like you did as well.
I did.
That to me is profoundly offensive that a guy could just walk up to the front and just say, guys, I'm the pastor now, and that's how it's going to be. And then there's a whole backstory there, isn't there? Because I'm trying to remember the whole story, but he claimed that he had the elders' backing, didn't he? But he didn't really. There was a whole story there. He never actually was ordained. He was never actually put in that position. So there's a lot of stuff that went on, even how he got the gig, isn't there? There's a whole, that's kind of starts itself out in a controversy, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he got the gig because it was his dad's church that he took over. So it wasn't just a church that came calling. And his dad all of a sudden dropped preaching, and then Doug was like, I think I can do this. And I mean, like I said, quite literally, it was he walked up to the pulpit, started preaching, and they said, I'm your pastor now. That's
Sure.
I mean, he can come in and deny and obfuscate on that story, but it's effectively this. We have talked to people who are part of that church in the 70s and 80s, and they said that's what happened. Doug can say whatever he wants, but that's what happened.
Yeah, the record is pretty clear. There's another big controversy, and I talked with a guy who was a part of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he was one of the first ones that started blowing the whistle on Doug Wilson years ago when the Southern slavery as it was controversy came out. What can you tell us about that? Because as I understand it, that him and his co-author were going to hold an academic symposium. I think it was supposed to be at the University of Idaho, something like in 2014. Maybe I got the date wrong. But it caused a firestorm when the people of Moscow found out what this book actually was about. So there's another whole piece to this as well, which is the whole racist slavery apologist end of it as well. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so he published Southern Slavery as It Was with co-author Steve Wilkins.
That's right. I was trying to remember the name.
Yep, 1996. It was a booklet. I think the booklet's like 32 pages long.
Yeah, it's not very long. It's a pamphlet, really. Little screed, basically.
If you can believe it, and hopefully people can hear my dripping sarcasm from that. If you can believe it, its explicit purpose was meant to light Moscow on fire and to try to kind of get a name for himself, because he was also going to debate somebody else as well. Nick Geyer, the professor you talked to, also debated him on slavery. I think there are one or two others as well. So he talks about the relationship between slave and slave owner during the 19th century Civil War, pre-Civil War, Jim Crow era was one. I guess he would say some of them were poor and some of the blacks were treated poorly and they had no wages, but some of them had good Christian owners. And generally speaking, it was a relationship that was superior to inferior, but the inferior didn't mind the fact that he was a slave and had a I don't know his exact words, but had something to the effect of had a better life than had he would have in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yep, if they'd stayed in Africa. Well, they got introduced to the gospel. That was one of the benefits that they received. It was like a relationship of mutual harmony.
That's right.
Great. It was wonderful. It was the classic sort of Southern view after the war, the lost cause mythology. Because I did a lot of research on that. I did a couple episodes on Southern slavery. I talked about biblical defense of slavery. Yep. And the interesting thing about the hermeneutic of the book is that if you read the first couple of paragraphs or the first pages or two, he actually bases his whole thing on abortion. He says the Bible can, if you're going to let the Bible slip on any one little topic, the whole edifice falls down. So he says, because the Bible condones slavery, therefore we have to defend, chattel slavery in the South, and then he goes from there. So you got to kind of pick your way through, don't you? But I remember reading, there was an article, it was a University of Idaho history professor, I can't remember his name, he wrote an article called Southern Slavery as It Wasn't.
There you go.
I don't know if you've come across that. It's a really good article, but he just goes
I do
through
remember
point by point.
I've seen this. Yep.
Yeah, it just rebuts everything in that book. So they have this symposium, this academic conference, and I think was it 2014, and that put Doug Wilson, Moscow, Idaho on the map. kind of for all the wrong reasons. But any publicity is good publicity from Doug Wilson's point of view, it seems like, isn't it?
Yeah, and the book that actually doesn't get mentioned in the Southern Slavery as it was discussion is what Doug came out with, and if I have the publication date right, it was 2005. He wrote Black and Tan.
Yeah, he revised his original book.
Which is revised because they got smoked, rightly smoked, because it was plagiarized at certain points. Yeah. The Southern Slavery as it was, because Steve Wilkins would, and then Doug went over and said, "Well, Steve Wilkins is the guy who plagiarized like his side. I didn't plagiarize a thing." I was like, "Yeah, right, buddy. That's how that stuff works."
That's how it works. Huh?
But then he expands it, and I think Black and Tan is like 150 pages, something like that. So it's both an edited, updated version, but also expanded. So if Doug says anything about him, like, I've changed my views, it's like, we may have changed your views and changed your views to be more racist, not less racist, because you said the same thing you said, you just quadrupled the size of the book to say more of it.
It doubled down. Yeah, and the other thing is he was quite dependent on Dabney, I think it was, who
Correct.
was a Southern Presbyterian
I know a lot about Dabney.
pastor before the Civil War, and then after wrote books on this sort of lost cause mythology of the South. And so there's another connection there, and that is with R.J. Rushdoony, because you mentioned Christian Reconstructionism. Rushdoony was one of the advocates of the Southern War thesis, the theological war thesis. I don't know if you've come across that, but it's basically this idea that the South, the pre-Civil War South, was a Christian society, a Christian nation. And how could God bless a Christian nation that owned slaves? That seems antithetical on the face of it, but their argument was, like, as you say, it was actually pretty good, and they were treating them in a biblical fashion. The slaves were actually happy, they were content, therefore God blessed the South. And so the Civil War was the result of Northern aggression coming in to try to destroy their way of life. So there's this whole theological war thesis, and R.J. Rushdoony, he's the father of Christian Reconstructionism. What's the connection there with a guy like Doug Wilson? Because he never actually seems like he never explicitly says, yeah, I'm a disciple of Rushdoony, I'm a Christian Reconstructionist. He uses a lot of the language, he flirts around with it. Where does Doug Wilson sort of fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, so I lean pretty heavily on a scholar, Michael McVicker, who's possibly the best scholar on Reconstructionism, especially so.
I've had him on the show before.
Yep, on R.J. Rushdoony. And I think he makes a pretty compelling case that if Doug has actually read R.J. Rushdoony, he doesn't understand R.J. Rushdoony. Because R.J. Rushdoony
not easy
would
to
be,
understand, yeah. I've
read he's on
a lot of his work.
He's not easy to understand, and he'd be dense. Like sort of blending categories, and this gets a little bit on the theologically academic side, but he leans what we call like Kuyperian, a little bit more like sphere sovereignty stuff, because he whole like governmental argument revolves around the family. There's like three pieces. There's a family, there's the community, and then there's the government. It's works something.
You have the church, the family, and the government. The sphere sovereignty, basically. Yeah.
So
that was advanced by Kuyper in the 19th century, wasn't it? It's kind of leaning on Calvin's original arguments a little bit as well.
Yeah, and I think McVicker makes a good case that in terms of like what we think of as modern Christian nationalism, and especially so the Wilsonian form, doesn't necessarily accord with Rushdoony. There'd be a difference between theonomy and Christian nationalism. And what Doug, like you said, and like we've talked about, Doug has no theological education, no formal education whatsoever in theology or even apologetics or Greek, Hebrew, Latin, anything else that might help you read the original text of the Bible. And he likes playing with Greek, even though when you watch it, like, you don't know what you're doing with this stuff whatsoever. But he knows just enough to like start blending things that don't blend well together. And so he'll take Rushdoony's work, but then what he's describing isn't Rushdoony's work. He's describing what we would think of today as modern Christian nationalism. But he'll take some of the elements of Rushdoony's reading of Dabney on Southern slavery, on the Christian Confederacy going against the Union, like you said. So he doesn't go to the source to look at the source and say, okay, how am I going to use this? He also look at Rushdoony for education, because Rushdoony was also a big proponent of what he called, and he sort of coined the term government schools.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So that's the next thing.
So
homeschooling, Christian schools.
Wilson uses a lot of that stuff too. So he he conflates aspects of it, but then also relies on one person's reading of another person's writing in order for him to get some of his theological and cultural ideas.
Yeah, I was going to say there's an interesting through line. So you can start with Rushdoony. You can go to a guy like Doug Wilson. When you end up with Pete Hegseth, because, okay, like you said, Rushdoony's idea of sphere sovereignty, for him, the family, like you said, was his core sort of theological
You don't mess
starting
with the
point.
family. Yep.
He would say the family is the nucleus of American society, of any society for that matter.
Correct.
Therefore, we have to raise up generations of Christian, godly families. Eventually, we will take dominion, because the key thing was Rushdoony was a post-millennialist. He was not a premillennialist by any stretch. He hated premillennialism.
Yep.
So his theology was, we have to establish the kingdom of Christ on earth first, then Jesus will return to have this millennial kingdom. He's not going to come at the beginning and rapture all the Christians out. So therefore, you got a guy like that. So he's saying, well, logically, how do we get there? What's the strategy by which we achieve dominion? Homeschooling, Christian day school. That's the best route to do that. So a guy like Doug Wilson picks that up. Obviously, he's a major figure in the homeschooling movement, Christian school movement. Pete Hegseth moves to Tennessee specifically to be part of one of Wilson's classical Christian schools. He uses this idea of a military sphere in addition to the church and the government and the family. So he's picking up these ideas like second, third, fourth generations, and he's running with these ideas. But you can trace them back to someone like R.J. Rushdoony, can't you?
Yep. Yeah, and I think what you said is pretty, and to summarize it as well, you can think of Rushdoony, which is why his form of what you'd say Christian or nationalizing the nations is a lot different than modern Christian nationalism, because modern Christian nationalism tends to work from the top down, which is the government has got to be Christian, has got to mandate Christian rules, Christian laws, and then impose that on the culture. Rushdoony would be the opposite. He'd say the families need to grow, need to populate, and then eventually the more Christian families you have, the more Christian influence on the nation you'll have. And so that's how, so Rushdoony's bottom to top. So you start with the family and grow from there. And then, like you said, a Hegseth would be like the opposite version of that.
Yeah. It's the idea. The ideas, though, they infuse it. We'll be back in just a few minutes in the second half of this conversation with Peter Bell from the Sons of Patriarchy podcast. When we come back, we're going to get really into the Pete Hegseth story. We've kind of set the background now as far as who Doug Wilson is. And if you want more information on this, you can go look this up on my past episodes. You can look it up, for example, on Spotify. And in fact, I've put the link to that in the show notes. I actually created a playlist on my account examining Doug Wilson's religious empire. And there must be about 6 or 7 episodes that I did a few years ago, really taking a deep dive into Doug Wilson, and I mentioned that, as I say, in this episode. But yes, a lot of real troubling stuff around Pete Hegseth, and even since we've done this recording a few weeks ago, there's obviously been more stuff that's come out. We know that Pete Hegseth is holding religious, very fundamentalist religious Christian services in the Pentagon, and of course what's just made the news the other day is he quoted from Pulp Fiction, a fictional Bible verse, so it's like every day there's something new coming out on the news cycle, what the latest outrage coming out of the Pentagon is. And of course, so much of this is not just driven by Christian nationalism, although certainly it is that, as we're going to discuss in the second half. I believe really what the CREC is. It's a cult. It's a very cult-like organization for sure. Doug Wilson himself, I firmly believe, is leading a cult. He is a cult leader. He fits many of the definitions of a cult leader. And so basically what you have in Pete Hegseth is a religious extremist who's really part of a cult. And he's leading the Pentagon, unfortunately, in an illegal war against Iran. And of course, we've all seen how that's played out over here in the UK. We've seen the effects of that war. The fuel prices have shot up, and it's been harder to get a hold of certain things. So we felt the impact, and it's certainly not just an American thing. It's a global thing. And speaking of the UK, I'm very glad that I live here. I've been here about 21 years now, going on my 21st year. I just had a very serious incident with a detached retina last week as I'm doing this recording now, and I ended up having to be rushed down to a Manchester hospital to an eye clinic there and had emergency retinal surgery. So I'm actually now recovering from that, and it's going to take up to 6 weeks. But the good news, of course, is I don't have to worry about paying a massive bill. I think if this happened and I was still living in the States, it would be somewhere around $25,000 to have this surgery done, plus all the associated costs I'd probably be paying for the rest of my life. But I'm very happy to have the NHS here, but that also means that I've had to rearrange with my guests. I was going to have Dr. Terry Daniel of the Ask Dr. Death podcast. She was going to be my guest at the end of this month for our April DDP Zoom call. Fortunately, we've been able to reschedule that to May. So I think we're going to do that. I think it's on the 24th of May. I'll keep you updated on that if you want to drop in on that call. I'm also going to have an episode with Terry coming up. She wrote an article that she's trying to get published now. It's all about spiritual bypassing. And we had a really fascinating discussion about that. It did have a little bit of audio problems, a couple of glitches here and there, but it's a really, really good discussion, very informative. So that is going to be dropping right after this one with Peter Bell. And I've got some other good guests lined up. I'm having to reschedule a few things here and there. I've got a few calls booked toward the end of the month. One is with Kelly Finch, and then returning guest Luke Wilson. We're going to be talking about his new book, and then Morgan Piercy. So we've got some really good stuff in the pipeline. Just have to kind of schedule around my recovery, but I'm trying not to let that stop me. The other thing too is I was going to release an episode from my book, which came out in September of 2024. It's called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. And this is, of course, available on Amazon. So somewhere between the one with Terry Daniel and this one now, I'm going to try to put that one out too. A couple more chapters from my book that you can check out. And if you do pick up a copy of my book, please do me a favor and leave a review, which helps greatly with the book's rankings on Amazon. All right, let's get on back into this episode. We are talking to Peter Bell from the Sons of Patriarchy podcast, looking at Pete Hegseth and Doug Wilson, Patriarchy, Power, and Politics. So how does Hegseth meet Doug Wilson? I've seen a little bit of this where he talks about how he met Doug Wilson. We got to trace this now, this modern day iteration of whatever this theology is. It is Christian nationalism, but it infused with theonomy, infused with this idea of Christians have to be in charge of society, including now the military. What's the connection? How did these two guys meet?
Yeah, so the story goes, and I'm not convinced that Pete and Doug met when they said they have met, because they say they've met sometime in 2024, and I'm not convinced at that date. And the reason is because Pete begins work on a book called Battle for the American Mind with David Goodwin, who's president of the ACCS. It gets published in 2022, which means they probably started the work in 2019, 2020, knowing how publishing works a little bit. And it's just hard for me to believe you meet the president of probably the biggest institution that Doug's part of and has founded, the ACCS, Association of Classical Christian Schools. David Goodwin founded the second or third, or it was very early on in the ACCS, right? Because ACCS begins in 1993. David Goodwin founds the Ambrose School in Boise, Idaho in 1994. So he's one of the very first ones to join. But Hegseth meets Goodwin because Goodwin had been on Fox News a few times to talk about education when Hegseth was one of the lead anchors for Fox News and Friends on the weekends. And he was so impressed with some of David Goodwin's stuff. And Charlie Kirk as well had been on the show with both Goodwin and Hegseth talking about classical Christian education. And Hegseth was so impressed with this that he starts texting and calling and talking with David Goodwin, says, hey, I really like this stuff. I need more of this stuff. And David's, again, the story goes, and I've heard, this is from David Goodwin. The story goes, he's like, hey, maybe we should write on this because Pete Hegseth had started looking into this and started talking about this in Fox News, the indoctrination of our schools, indoctrination of public schooling. We need more Christian schooling out there. This is a point when Pete's living in New Jersey, and he and his kids are going to an Acts 29 congregation in New Jersey. And so he meets Goodwin there. He meets Goodwin, obviously part of the Fox News and Friends thing, and they start working on this book. It gets published in 2022, and then Hegseth claims he's like, I didn't know who Doug Wilson was at all until 2024 when he was appointed for the Secretary of Defense position from Donald Trump. And supposedly that's when he and Doug really link arms, but he gets into the Doug Wilson explicit Christian nationalist world time in 2019, 2020, and especially during COVID as well. But it starts through ACCS, which you're probably as surprised that like it's just that has not been talked about at all by anybody. Like how Pete gets into the people talk about the CREC and Doug, but I mean Pete's world goes or Pete's introduction goes before this, at least into all this interconnected stuff.
Yeah, I watched a little clip, the one where Doug Wilson preached at the Pentagon not long ago. And in the lead up to, or after Doug Wilson's finished his sermon, Pete Hegseth comes up and he told that exact story. That's what he said. He met this guy on Fox News when he was a pundit and he was an anchor and all the rest of it. And they started working together. And somehow through that, he met Doug Wilson. And he was so happy and so thankful to God that he met Doug Wilson, blah, blah, blah. So you're questioning that narrative. Do you think it was a bit earlier than that or wasn't quite so straightforward?
I'm questioning his timeline of meeting Doug in 2024. I can't, there's no way for me to prove it. I have no hard evidence, but it's hard for me to think that the dude who founded the very school network that you're talking to the president of, that David Goodwin didn't Doug's name or say, hey, you should meet this guy. I find it hard to believe that, like, with the interconnectedness being so strong, that there wasn't at least some correspondence before that.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is a lot of people that didn't watch Fox News, I didn't really know who Pete Hegseth was. I knew he was a Fox News character. I don't watch Fox News at all.
Neither do I. I have no idea who he was.
Right-wing watcher or something, you know. But all of a sudden here this guy comes up and he's going to be nominated for, as you say, the Secretary of Defense, which is what it was back then.
Correct.
And there was two immediate streams that came out of those hearings. One, of course, was Hegseth's background. You know, he's a drunken fool. He's a assaulter of women, potentially even a rapist. I mean, this is horrific stuff.
Multiple divorces and remarriages and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. He's a complete piece of work. He ran two veterans charities into the ground. Then it was discovered that he's got these very extremist tattoos, Crusader thing, the Deus Vult, the Jerusalem Cross, M16. You know, he's got some really, and he was actually flagged up. I think he was still in the National Guard, wasn't he, during Biden's inauguration? And some of his fellow soldiers said, this guy's an extremist, and he was banned from, so you got that Pete Hegseth. Then you got the other guy who's this incredibly fundamentalist, diehard, Doug Wilsonian, Christian Reconstructionist, whatever he is. That's another piece. When did he become a Christian? Because that Hegseth doesn't seem to be, because I think people thought, well, Hegseth's going to get into he survived all that, even Signalgate and everything else.
Yep.
Where's this connection? Where does he become a Christian? How does that all happen?
Yeah, the only reference points I have are from what CREC people have said about Pete Hegseth. But so Brooks Pottinger and the former pastoral intern at Pilgrim Hill, Joshua Hames, they claim that when Pete joins Pilgrim Hill sometime in 2022, so he was at his kids were at Jonathan Edwards Classical Academy. They began there sometime 2021, early 2022, which was, from what I've heard, is no longer an ACCS church because of the Pete Hegseth, or ACCS school, because of the Pete Hegseth connection, which is interesting. So the school that his kids are at are like, we don't want to be associated with this at all anymore whatsoever.
We're going to disavow ourselves.
Yeah, disavow. But the story is when he joins Pilgrim Hill, he immediately gives his life to Jesus. He starts hearing the pure gospel. He repents of all of his sins. He tells Brooks and Josh was like, hey guys, I've slept with all these women. I've had these divorces. I've been adulterous. Like, please, this is past me, behind me. I really want to learn the pure and true and holy gospel. And I want Jesus to have the hold of my soul. So the official thing you'll hear sometime 2022, which is again why I don't believe that he met Doug for the first time in 2024, because he was already part of this church network, the church denomination, in 2022.
And Doug Wilson's like you say, the spider at the center of the web.
If you're in the CREC, you know who Doug Wilson is. I mean, whether or not you like him, whether or not you know that much about him, you at least know who he is. Yeah,
it's not that big of a denomination. I don't know how many CREC churches are there. There's a few in different countries as well, but there's not that many, are there? 400 or something like that?
There's 160 or 170 right now. They have exploded since COVID, and they're growing by leaps and bounds. But yeah, it's not and I think its total membership is somewhere 25,000, 30,000 total.
Yeah, not a huge, nothing like Southern Baptist or anything like that. I mean,
No, yeah, Southern Baptist is like 12 million. Yeah, this is
exactly.
Yeah,
We're
this
talking
would be,
millions. They're talking a few.
This would be not a micro denomination, but pretty near to it.
Yeah, and it's very small. So what's your concern about Pete Hegseth? What, looking at some of the stuff he said recently, he's spoken at the Pentagon. I was looking at some of the stuff he said. He's praying these, what we used to call, imprecatory prayers.
Yep.
Straight out of the Bible. God is training my fingers for battle, preparing my fingers for war, and, make every round count. And, it's this violent rhetoric, but it's all laced in, it's not just Christian nationalism, it's very Islamist stuff as well, which a lot of his stuff in his book, American Crusade, is really anti-Islam. Like, Islam is the number one enemy facing the West anymore. We got to stand for Christianity, stand for America. What's your concern with a guy like Pete Hegseth being in charge?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple concerns. I'm not a politician, so it's the foreign policy stuff makes a little bit less sense to me. The theology stuff makes a lot more sense to me. But when I see he's like one of those kids, and I'm sure you having gone to seminary and PhD work, he's like one of those kids who has just enough theological knowledge to be really stinking dangerous. Like, he has a semester of Greek behind him, and he thinks he's like, I know I can read all this stuff. I'm pretty good at Homer. I'm pretty good with Aristotle. I can read all the classical Greek stuff. Or he likes dropping Greek bombs in all of his sermons, even though he's like, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. And this is really bad stuff.
For those of us that spent years studying Greek and Hebrew, it's like really going back to Doug Wilson, isn't it? I'm really offended, man. I spent years studying Greek, Hebrew, syntax, grammar, lexicography, and all that. It was so much work. So you don't just pick up a concordance and grab a couple Greek words and suddenly you're an expert in the language.
So that's him having a bit of theological knowledge is not necessarily my worry. It's because he's running the world's largest, most powerful military with a hair's breadth of some theological background, but his theology just isn't, like, it'd be one thing if it was consistent. It's another thing entirely because it's inconsistent. Because if you read and look at, and if you sort of know what you're doing theologically and you listen to him, and this gets, again, kind of technical, but like, he doesn't sound like a reformed dude up there who's talking about this post-millennial vision. He kind of sounds like your rank and file 70s and 80s evangelical who's like a premillennial dispensationalist Zionist kind of person who's like, okay, Israel is this nation state that we have to be looking for. There's this Messiah who's going to come down either pre or after the rapture, and he's going to come and make war on Armageddon. And then he'll add some nationalistic elements to it. He'll add, again, the premillennial aspects to it. He'll add some war language onto it. He'll use the imprecatory prayers, like you said, as well, and then place himself in America as the righteous nation, and then everybody else who's against us or is not quite like us in the wicked shoes. So it's a kid who's playing with legitimate fire, actual real fire.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, this is cool. I didn't expect this, and what can I do with it?
Yeah, someone handed him the keys to the Pentagon. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Here's a guy. I mean, I think this is a good overview. If people don't understand the bigger picture, we've traced this, through line from a guy like Rushdoony through Doug Wilson to Pete Hegseth, the generations, because this was something I remember from seminary. One of my professors used to say, you'll have a pioneering theologian like John Calvin, for example, or Luther, the Reformation. These were huge watershed moments in Christian theology. But when you get 3 and 4 and 5 generations down the line, their school of thought, another generation of theologians comes along and they improve it, they adapt it, they change it. 3 and 4 generations later, Calvin wouldn't necessarily recognize a lot of what goes by Calvinism, So I think that's kind of a good sort of example of what maybe is going on with a guy like Hegseth. Yeah. He's not necessarily reading Institutes of Biblical Law by Rushdoony, is he?
I don't think he knows what he's doing whatsoever when it comes to theological stuff.
Yeah, he's
like I said, he's got just enough.
Out.
Yeah, and that's the thing, something they've heard about one of these theologians, but then also like particularize it and focus it on something that it was never meant to focus on or be particularized on, and they'll contextualize it in a way that's either A, ahistorical, or B, like you said, anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic. Whether or not that was the original person's intention, it is the person who's using their intention, and that is a weapon in the hands of somebody who's wielding it for nefarious ends.
Yeah, and he's got a literal weapon on the other end. Well, you know,
exactly.
He's not the only one
That's
who's
the
doing
scary
it.
part. Yeah.
Yeah, he's not. It's not just weaponized. It is weaponized Christian nationalism, theonomy.
Legitimately
Well, I was going to
weaponized,
say,
yeah.
I noticed the other day, that we had that Easter service at the White House,
Yep.
and Paula White Cain, she's comparing Trump to Jesus and everything.
Yep.
And then Franklin Graham got up. I don't know if you saw that. He concluded the service with a prayer. I don't know if you saw Franklin Graham's prayer, but it was, to me, as a theologian myself, I'm an ex-evangelical, but I have a PhD in theology. I know how to read Hebrew and Greek. I've studied the Old Testament. I did my PhD thesis on the book of Ezekiel, and he gets up there and he says basically this prayer whereby he's taking the book of Esther and saying the Persians in the book of Esther are basically the modern day Iranians today.
Yep.
He
I remember seeing
equates
that. Yep.
this contextualization whereby he says they wanted to wipe out the Jews all in one night in the book of Esther. So do the Iranians today. So everything Trump's
Right.
doing by starting this war is okay. It's blessed by God because, he just conflates so much. I'm thinking, no, Franklin Graham, you know better than that. There's no way you can tell me.
Or does he know
as
better
a
than
scholar,
that?
you can't do that.
Yeah.
But he did.
Yeah, and
he's doing it.
It's a very similar prayer to the one. It wasn't a prayer that. So
Yeah,
it was
it
a
was-
Friday or Thursday that Hegseth also talked about. There's like you died, like the soldier died on a Friday, or he was persecuted on a Friday, and then on Saturday he had to hide, just like Jesus was in the tomb.
Yeah.
And then
The pilot that was
Sunday
shot
he's
down.
released, or he gets out just like Jesus was rose from the dead, and a similar sort of prayer from 2 months ago. This is before the Pentagon prayer, or the Pentagon thing with Wilson, where he talks about American soldiers whose deaths on the battlefield are their entrance into eternal life because of what they're doing for America. And it's like it's somebody who's using the Christian faith to advance his form of American warfare and trying to rally up his troops, say like, hey, you reap eternal rewards for this, for what you're doing for our nation.
Yeah, it's the ultimate American jihad, isn't it? I read an article where it said basically Pete Hegseth is a crusader. He wishes he was a crusader. The irony, of course, is that all the rhetoric around the Crusades, if you read the sermons by the Pope that got everybody starting on the crusade, he basically said that same thing. Anyone who dies in this battle to free Jerusalem from the Muslims, which is the same enemy that Hegseth is on about now, you're going to go straight to heaven. So your sins are absolved. You get immediate absolution. So here's this. But yet the Crusades failed. They didn't work. Eventually, the Muslims kicked them back out of the Holy Land. So Pete Hegseth is glorifying this period of history with a lot of cruelty and barbarism, bathed in this Christian theology, Deus Vult, God wills it, and yet they failed. They didn't actually win in the end. So the ultimate irony, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, which is why it's people like how have Wilson's ideas informed Hegseth? Like, to be honest, they haven't really done their job. If Hegseth's listening to Wilson, because I like some of the mistakes that Hegseth makes. I mean, for as bad as of a theologian as Doug is, I don't think he'd make the same mistakes that Hegseth is. But like I said, he's got just enough to be tremendously dangerous.
Exactly.
And he has a literal weapon, and he's got the thumb on the red button, and he can give whatever rationalization he does. And then he does because he knows if he uses Jesus' name, crusader-like language, holy war imagery, he'll get Christian or some form of very conservative Christian support behind him. So he can do whatever he wants because he drops the name. He gives a theological rationale. So just like Trump, he's got evangelical coalition behind him because he parrots the same names that they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a very transactional relationship, isn't it? Well, listen, I got to let you go. We've been talking for almost an hour. Just let us know before we go, where can people find you? Can they get a hold of you on social media? Where can you find the Sons of Patriarchy podcast? I'm assuming it's wherever podcasts are found.
Yeah.
Is there any special platform?
Wherever podcasts are found, we're probably mostly on Apple Podcast and YouTube, sonsofpatriarchy.com. So if you type in Sons of Patriarchy, there will be a lot of results for that. And we're probably most active on Facebook, if people want to find us on there, and Instagram as well. We used to be pretty active on X and Twitter, but that's become a cesspool of craziness.
That's true.
So Yep, you can find us on those platforms.
I find myself, I'm more active on Threads, I think, these days, but there's a lot of MAGA Trump people on Threads. I was on Blue Sky for a while, but it's just too many platforms, and that you got to juggle some social media. It just becomes too much. Well, listen, Peter, thank you so much. I hope we stay in touch, man. It's been finally good to get in touch with you. Kind of a wealth of information. I think it's really going to help educate people on the dangers of what's going on, as if they're not concerned enough already, But thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.